Colonel Von Reyes lifted his radio to his cracked lips, watched the first artillery shell tear Ember Ridge open like paper, and smiled. "No survivors," he said. "Bury them where they stand." 90 of his best soldiers surged up the slope. Below them, a handful of pinned Americans screamed for help that would never come. Reyes had planned this for months. He wanted them erased. He did not know that inside a locked supply case, unnoticed, unwanted, forgotten by everyone, a quiet girl was already reaching for something that would turn his perfect massacre into the worst mistake of his life. Before we begin, if you love stories where the underdog rises when everyone has given up, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one gets better with every minute. And do me a small favor. Comment the name of the city you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story has traveled across the world. Now let's begin. The first thing Sergeant Marcus Donovan learned that morning was that a routine mission is only routine until the second it isn't. They had been told it would be quiet. That was the word command used. Quiet. A defensive hold on a nothing ridge in the middle of nowhere. A stretch of rock and scrub grass with a name nobody could pronounce until somebody stuck a flag on it and called it Ember Ridge. 29 soldiers of Alpha Platoon had walked up that slope at dawn expecting boredom. They had joked about it on the trucks. Somebody had said this was the kind of posting you got when the brass forgot you existed. Everybody laughed. Donovan laughed too. He would remember that later. The laughing. How easy it had been. The shell hit at 6:42 in the morning. There was no warning, no whistle in the sky that anyone heard in time, just the world coming apart. One moment, Donovan was crouched behind a low stone wall, chewing a stale strip of jerky, and the next moment the wall was gone, and so was the man who had been standing beside it. The blast lifted Donovan off his feet and threw him backward into the dirt, and for a stretch of time he could not measure, he heard nothing at all. Not the screaming, not the second shell, not the third, just a high, thin ringing like the whole world had been reduced to a single tone held forever. Then his hearing came back all at once, and it came back as chaos. Contact. Contact. We've got contact everywhere. Where's the fire coming from? Anybody see the fire? They're on the east slope. They're on the east slope. Get down, get down. Donovan rolled onto his stomach and pushed himself up on his elbows and looked at the ridge that had been quiet 90 seconds ago, and what he saw did not make sense. There were men coming up the slope. Not a few. Not a squad. A wave of them moving in coordinated bounds, one group laying down fire, while another sprinted forward, then switching again, the way only trained soldiers move. This was not a raid, This was an operation. Somebody had planned this down to the minute. Sergeant Corporal Ray Whitfield was suddenly beside him, blood running from a cut above his eye. His voice pitched high with something that wasn't quite panic yet, but was reaching for it. "Sergeant, what do we do? What do we do?" Donovan grabbed the radio off his vest. "Command, this is Alpha Actual. We are under heavy assault at Ember Ridge. We need immediate support." "Say again, immediate support. We are pinned and taking casualties." He released the button. Static. He tried again. "Command, do you copy? This is Alpha Actual." More static, and then buried in the hiss, a fragment of a voice chopped and useless, gone before it meant anything. He looked at the radio in his hand like it had betrayed him. "Comms are down," he said. Whitfield stared at him. "What do you mean comms are down? They can't be down. Sergeant, they can't be down. They're jamming us." Donovan said it flatly because saying it flatly was the only way to say it without losing his mind. "They knew we'd call for help. They're jamming the whole net." He grabbed Whitfield by the collar and pulled him low as a burst of machine gun fire chewed the ground where his head had been. "Listen to me. No air support, no quick reaction force, no backup coming because nobody knows we're screaming. You understand me? It is us. Right now, it is just us." He watched the words land on the younger man's face, watched something crumble behind his eyes, and Donovan felt the same thing collapsing inside himself and forced it down, buried it because he was the sergeant, and the sergeant was not allowed to fall apart in front of the men who were looking to him to tell them they were going to live. "Get to cover," Donovan said. "Get everybody who can move to the North Rocks. Now, go." They ran. The next 4 minutes were the longest of Donovan's life. He would try in the years that came after to describe those 4 minutes to people who had never been shot at, and he would always fail because there was no way to make somebody understand what it was to move across open ground while an enemy tried with everything they had to kill you. He half-dragged Private Kowalski, who had taken shrapnel in the leg, and he shouted at men to move, and men moved, and some men did not. And he did not let himself look too long at the ones who did not. By the time they reached the cluster of boulders on the north side of the ridge, Donovan had counted his platoon in his head the way you count coins in your pocket, feeling for what was missing. 29 had walked up the slope. He got maybe 20 into cover. Maybe. He couldn't be sure. There were men down out there in the open and no way to reach them. And the ones in cover were pressed flat against the rock with their hands over their heads, while enemy rounds spanged and screamed off the stone above them. "How many rounds you got?" Donovan asked Whitfield. "2 mags, maybe 3. Sanchez, 2. "Anybody got more than 3 mags?" Donovan called out, and nobody answered, and that told him everything. They had come up for a quiet hold. Nobody carries a war's worth of ammunition to a quiet hold. He risked a look over the top of the boulder and pulled his head back down as a round cracked past his ear so close he felt the heat of it. They had them surrounded, or they would in minutes. He could see the enemy fanning out along the lower slope, machine gun teams setting up on the flanks, infantry pushing up the middle and further back hidden in the tree line, the flash and thump of mortars beginning to walk their explosions closer and closer to the north rocks. Whoever was running this had done it before. They weren't just attacking, they were closing a box. Donovan understood that in a cold and total way that they were going to die on this ridge. All of them. It was a mathematics problem, and the math did not work. 90 trained soldiers with artillery and mortars and machine guns against 20 men with 3 magazines apiece and no way to call for help. He did the sum, and the sum came out to a slaughter. And in the middle of that understanding, something in him refused. Not hope. Hope was too soft a word for what he felt. It was closer to spite. The pure animal refusal of a man who has decided that if he is going to die, the enemy is going to pay a terrible price for the privilege. He turned to his platoon, 20 terrified faces pressed against cold rock, and he made himself sound like a man who still had a plan. "Listen up," he said. "I need eyes on their machine guns. I need to know where every gun is before we do anything. Whitfield, you watch the left. Sanchez, right. Everybody else conserve ammo. Do not fire unless you have a target you cannot miss." He wiped blood and dirt from his face. "We are going to make them earn this ridge. Every foot of it. You hear me?" A few voices answered. Weak, but they answered. Then Donovan asked the question. He didn't plan to ask it. It came out of him from some deep place, from every war movie he had ever watched as a kid, and every impossible story he had ever heard about one person changing everything. And he knew, even as he said it, that it was probably a fool's question, a drowning man reaching for a rope that wasn't there. "Any snipers here?" he shouted. "I need a long gun. I need somebody who can reach out and touch those machine gun teams before they cut us apart." "Anybody. Any snipers." Silence answered him. Not the silence of no, the silence of men who wished they could say yes and couldn't. He looked from face to face, from Whitfield to Sanchez to Kowalski bleeding against the rock, to the mechanic and the 2 radio techs and the supply kid, and every one of them looked back at him with the same helpless apology in their eyes. "Anybody," Donovan said again, quieter now, almost to himself. "Come on, anybody." And that was when the quiet girl stood up. Nobody noticed her at first. That was the thing about Private Elena Brooks that Donovan would think about for the rest of his life. Nobody ever noticed her. She had been in his platoon for 4 months, and he could count on one hand the number of full sentences she had spoken to him. She was logistics, supply. She kept the ammunition inventory and the ration counts and the requisition forms, and she did it well, and she did it silently. And Donovan had honestly, if he was being truthful with himself, half forgotten she was up here on the ridge at all. She was the kind of soldier who dissolved into the background of every room she entered, small, watchful, a little too still. Now she was on her feet, moving in a low crouch through the incoming fire like it wasn't there, and she wasn't heading toward Donovan. She was heading toward the pile of supply cases they'd hauled up at dawn. "Brooks," Donovan shouted. "Brooks, get down. What the hell are you doing? Get back in cover." She didn't answer. She reached the cases and dropped beside the largest one, a long, black, locked container that Donovan had assumed held spare parts or tools, one of 100 boring boxes that logistics soldiers dragged from post to post. She pulled a key from a cord around her neck, a key Donovan had never seen, and she opened the lock and she flipped the lid. Donovan couldn't see inside from where he was, But he saw her hands move, and he saw the look on Whitfield's face as the corporal closer than Donovan got a clear view of what was in that case. "Sergeant," Whitfield said. His voice had gone strange. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Elena Brooks lifted the rifle out of the case. It was a Barrett, a long, heavy, wicked thing built for one purpose. And there was no version of reality in which a logistics private was supposed to have one. And there was certainly no version in which one had ridden up to Ember Ridge in a locked case that nobody knew about. Donovan stared at it, and then he stared at her, and something cold walked up his spine because the way she was holding that rifle was wrong. Not wrong like she was scared of it. Wrong like it was an extension of her own arms. Wrong like she'd held it 10,000 times. "Brooks," Donovan said slowly. "What is that?" Where did that come from? She was already assembling it. Her hands moved with a speed and precision that made no sense, snapping components into place, seating the magazine, working the action. And she did it all without looking the way a person ties their shoes, the way a person does something so deep in their muscle memory that the conscious mind isn't even required. Her face was perfectly calm. That was the part that unsettled Donovan more than the rifle. Everyone else on this ridge wore terror like a second skin. Elena Brooks looked like a woman doing paperwork. "Get me a spotter," she said. It was the most Donovan had ever heard her say at once, and her voice had changed. It wasn't the soft, apologetic murmur of the supply clerk who signed his forms. It was flat and level and absolutely certain, a voice that expected to be obeyed. "A spotter," Donovan repeated. "Someone with eyes on the slope who can call distance and adjustment," she said, settling into a firing position behind the boulder, laying the long barrel across a notch in the rock with a gentleness that was almost tender. "I can work without one. It'll be faster with one. Your choice, Sergeant. But choose fast." Donovan didn't move. His mind was scrambling to catch up with what his eyes were telling him. "Brooks, your supply," he said. "You count boxes. You don't." "Machine gun team left, flank 200 meters," Elena said, cutting him off, her eye pressed to the scope. "They're relaying the gun to enfilade your north rocks. In about 20 seconds, every man behind these boulders is going to be exposed to grazing fire, and half of you are going to die." She paused. "Do you want me to talk about my job description, Sergeant, or do you want me to kill them?" Donovan's mouth was dry. Around him, the platoon had gone still, every man watching this exchange with a kind of stunned disbelief. And Donovan understood that whatever this was, whatever she was, it was the only card left on the table. "Kill them," he said. The rifle spoke. Donovan had heard a Barrett fire before on a range in a controlled environment where you expected it. He was not prepared for it here in the middle of everything, the concussion of it, slamming through the air like the hand of God, so loud and so sudden that half the platoon flinched. 200 meters down the slope, behind a low mound of earth where the enemy machine gun team was hunched over their weapon, one of the soldiers simply came apart. The gun went silent. For a moment, one single moment, the entire flow of the battle seemed to hesitate. The enemy machine gun that had been about to cut Alpha Platoon to pieces was now a dead thing, manned by dead men, and the soldiers around it were suddenly looking over their shoulders because they had just learned that the pinned, dying Americans on the ridge had teeth they didn't know about. Elena Brooks worked the action. A brass casing tumbled out and rang against the rock. "That's one," she said. Donovan stared at her, and then he stared at the silent machine gun nest. And then he stared back at her, and a thought went through his head that he would never quite be able to shake for the rest of his life. The thought was this: we are not going to die today, and I have no idea who this woman is. "Whitfield," Donovan said without taking his eyes off Elena. "Get over here, you're her spotter." "Me, Sergeant, I don't know how to—" "You've got eyes, and you can count. That's all she needs." Donovan crawled closer to Elena, close enough to speak low, close enough that the rest of the platoon couldn't hear. "Brooks, I don't know what's going on, and right now I don't care, and we are going to have a very long conversation about it if we live through the next hour. But I need to know one thing before I put my platoon's life in your hands." He looked at her. "Can you actually do this? Can you hold them?" For the first time, Elena took her eye from the scope and looked at him directly. Her eyes were a plain, unremarkable gray, and there was nothing in them at all. No fear, no bravado, no excitement, just a flat and bottomless calm that was somehow more frightening than any amount of fear would have been. "Sergeant," she said, "I have been holding lines you've never heard of against enemies you've never been briefed on for 7 years. This is not the worst position I've ever been in. She put her eye back to the scope. It's not even close. Now get your men to conserve ammunition and let me work. She fired again. Down the slope, an enemy soldier who had been directing traffic with hand signals, waving units forward, coordinating the advance, dropped without a sound. Donovan hadn't even seen him as a target. To Donovan, he'd been one more shape among 100 shapes. But Elena had seen something else. She'd seen that the man was giving orders, that he was a node, a point of control, and she'd removed him. And now the unit he'd been directing, bunched up in confusion, uncertain. Their forward momentum stuttering. That was the moment Donovan first understood what he was watching. She wasn't shooting soldiers. Anyone could shoot soldiers. She was shooting the connections between soldiers. She was reading the enemy the way a chess player reads a board, seeing not just the pieces but the intentions behind them, and she was reaching out with that terrible rifle and severing the threads that held the whole assault together one at a time. Sergeant, Whitfield breathed, crouched beside Elena, now watching through his own scope where she pointed. Sergeant, they're stopping. The middle push, they're stopping. They're not stopping, Elena said. They're waiting for orders that aren't coming because I just killed the man who gives them. Whitfield, right side. Tell me what you see at the tree-lined base of the big rock 10 o'clock. Whitfield swung his scope. There's guys, 3-4 guys. They've got something on a tripod, a tube. Mortar, Elena said. That's the team that's been walking rounds into your position. Distance. I can't. 340 meters, Elena said, already adjusting. It's fine, I've got it. She breathed out wrong and slow, and in the pause between one heartbeat and the next, the rifle fired, and 340 meters away, through a gap in the trees so narrow that Donovan wouldn't have believed a shot was possible. The mortar team stopped being a threat. The mortar stopped falling. And on the ridge, for the first time since 6:42 that morning, the men of Alpha Platoon dared to lift their heads. She got the mortars, someone whispered. She got the mortars. Did you see that she got the mortars through the trees? Who is she? Nobody knows. She's Supply. Supply my ass, look at her. Quiet, Donovan snapped, but there was no heat in it because he was thinking the exact same thing. He looked at Elena Brooks lying behind that boulder, with her cheek against the stock of a rifle that shouldn't exist, calmly disassembling an entire enemy assault plan. One shot at a time, and he thought, not for the last time, who are you, and why were you hiding in my supply chain, and what in God's name did you do for 7 years that made you like this? But there was no time to ask. The enemy was recovering. Down the slope, a new voice had taken control. Donovan couldn't hear it, but he could see its effects, could see the enemy formations tightening up, could see the confusion of the last few minutes hardening back into purpose. Somebody down there had realized what was happening. Somebody had realized that all of their casualties, all of their sudden losses of key men weren't random, weren't luck. Somebody had figured out that there was a marksman on that ridge picking apart their command structure with surgical precision, and that somebody was now trying to hunt her. They're looking for me, Elena said calmly, as if she'd read Donovan's thoughts. Good. As long as they're looking for me, they're not overrunning you. Brooks, they'll send a counter sniper. Probably already have. It's what I'd do. She shifted position slightly, sliding lower behind the rock, changing the angle of her barrel. When he sets up, he'll want elevation, and he'll want a clear line to this position, which means he's got maybe 3 places he can go. I've already picked them out. She paused. Whitfield, watch the ridge across the valley, high ground. Tell me if you see any movement at all. A glint, a shadow, anything. Donovan's heart was pounding. He'd been in firefights before, but he'd never been in anything like this. This strange, deadly stillness in the middle of chaos, this quiet woman conducting a battle like an orchestra, while men died on both ends of her attention. There, Whitfield said suddenly. There, high ground. I saw something, a flash, right at the... I see him, Elena said. Donovan looked and saw nothing. Just a distant ridgeline, gray rock against gray sky, 1,000 places a man could hide. 620 meters, Elena murmured, more to herself than to anyone. Crosswind quartering maybe 8 miles an hour. He thinks he's found a good hide. He's not wrong. It's a good hide. It's just not good enough. She went very still. Her breathing slowed until Donovan couldn't tell if she was breathing at all. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "This is the part where we find out how good he is." The rifle fired. For a long second, nothing happened, and Donovan thought she'd missed, and his stomach dropped, because if she'd missed, then the enemy counter-sniper now knew exactly where she was, and the next shot might be his. Then Whitfield made a sound that was half a laugh and half something closer to a sob. "You got him," he said. "Sergeant, she got him. 600 meters, she got the counter-sniper. Oh my God, who is this woman?" And Elena Brooks, without any expression at all, without triumph or relief or anything a normal person might feel after winning a duel against another human being at 600 meters with both their lives on the line, simply worked the action, let the brass ring against the rock, and said, "That's 5. Whitfield, back to the slope. They'll try to push again now that they think their sniper cleared me. They're wrong. Let's not correct them until it's too late for them to matter." Donovan sank back against the boulder and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since dawn. Around him, the platoon was transformed. 10 minutes ago, they had been 20 terrified men waiting to die. Now they were watching their supply clerk kill an army, and something had changed in them, some current of impossible, ferocious hope, and Donovan knew he had to use that current before it faded. "Alpha," he said, rising into a crouch, moving among his men. "Listen to me. Listen. She is buying us time, and I need us to use it. I want the wounded consolidated in the center. Sanchez, you and Kowalski get everybody who can't fight into the deepest cover we've got. Whitfield stays with Brooks. Everyone else, I want firing positions covering both flanks. She's breaking their command, but if they get close enough for a rush, we still have to hold the line ourselves. You understand? She can't do it alone. Nobody does this alone. Now move." And they moved. Not like broken men anymore, like soldiers. Donovan crawled back to Elena's position where she lay scanning the slope, patient as a stone. "Brooks," he said quietly, "how many rounds do you have?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was as flat as ever, but Donovan thought he heard buried somewhere far down beneath the calm the very first thread of something human. "Not enough," she said. "Not for what's coming." "What's coming?" She was silent for a moment. Then, "They have spent the last 10 minutes learning that they can't take this ridge with coordination because I keep killing their coordination. So they're going to stop trying to be clever. They're going to mass everything they have left and throw it up this slope all at once. Armor, infantry, flanking units, everything simultaneously. And they're going to trust that even a good shooter can only kill so many targets before the numbers overwhelm her." She adjusted her scope. "And they're right. That is how you beat someone like me. You accept the casualties and you drown her in bodies." Donovan felt the cold return to his spine. "Then how do we survive it?" For the first time all morning, Elena Brooks smiled. It was a small smile and it did not reach her eyes, and it was one of the most frightening things Donovan had ever seen. "You don't kill the bodies," she said. "You don't have the rounds for the bodies. You kill the reasons the bodies are moving. You find the 3 or 4 men down there whose deaths turn an assault into a panic, and you take them at the exact moment their deaths do the most damage, and you let the enemy's own fear finish the job for you. She looked at him. "It's not about how many you kill, Sergeant. It's about which ones and when." Donovan stared at her. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Elena Brooks put her eye back to the scope, and for a long moment she didn't answer, and Donovan thought she wasn't going to. Then she said in a voice so quiet he almost missed it under the crackle of gunfire, "Shadowline." Donovan's blood went cold. He knew the name. Everybody in a certain corner of the service knew the name the way you know the name of a thing that isn't supposed to be real, a rumor, a ghost story. Soldiers told each other about a program that didn't officially exist. Deep cover operators who went places nobody would admit they'd been and did things nobody would admit had happened. Long-range interdiction, command decapitation. Men and women who could disappear into a logistics unit or a supply depot or a refugee column and wait sometimes for years for the one moment they were meant for. Donovan had always assumed Shadowline was a myth, a campfire story, something old sergeants used to spook the new recruits. He looked at Elena Brooks, 26 years old, 5'4", a supply clerk who signed his ammunition forms in neat little handwriting, and he understood that Shadowline was not a myth, and that one of them had been sitting in his platoon for 4 months, and that he had never once looked at her twice. 7 years, he said. It wasn't a question. You said 7 years. 7, much fun. 7 years, Elena confirmed. Embedded mostly. Cover identities. You'd be surprised how invisible a woman with a clipboard can be. Something flickered across her face there and gone. That was the point. The invisibility was the whole point. I wasn't supposed to ever pick this rifle up in front of any of you. I was supposed to be a supply clerk who rotated home and nobody ever knew any different. She fired, and somewhere down the slope, another enemy officer folded to the ground. But then they started shelling this ridge, and I did the math same as you did, Sergeant. And the math said everybody up here dies unless somebody stops being invisible. Donovan didn't know what to say, so he said the only true thing he had. Thank you, he said. Elena Brooks didn't answer. She just kept working, kept scanning, kept killing, and Donovan realized that thanks meant nothing to her. That gratitude was a currency from a country she didn't live in anymore. That she had crossed some line a long time ago into a place where you did what needed to be done, and you didn't wait around to be thanked for it because thanks didn't keep anyone alive. He was about to crawl back to his men when Whitfield spoke, and his voice had changed again, and this time it was pure dread. Sergeant Brooks, look at the valley. They looked. Down at the base of the slope where the tree line met the open ground, engines were coming to life. Donovan could hear them now under the gunfire, the deep diesel growl of armored vehicles, and he could see them nosing out of the trees, angular shapes of dull green steel. 1, 2, 3 of them, and behind them and around them, massing in the tree line, more infantry than Alpha Platoon had faced all morning, gathering into a single overwhelming fist. That's it, Elena said softly. That's the final wave. Everything they have left, all at once, exactly like I said. She reached down and touched the pouch at her side where her remaining rounds waited, and Donovan saw her count them by feel of her fingers moving over the brass, and he saw her face when she reached the end of the count. It was the first time all morning that Elena Brooks looked like she might not have enough. How many? Donovan asked. His mouth was dry again. She didn't tell him the number. Instead, she said, enough for the ones that matter. If I don't miss. She settled deeper behind the rifle. And I don't miss. Brooks. Donovan grabbed her shoulder, and she let him, and he felt how thin and hard it was under his hand, all wire and bone, a body that had been reduced to nothing but function years ago. When this is over, if we live, you're going to tell me the whole thing, all 7 years, every bit of it. For just a second, something moved behind Elena Brooks's flat gray eyes. Something that might have been the ghost of a much younger woman, a woman who existed before Shadowline reached out and hollowed her into this, and Donovan felt a sudden, unexpected grief for whoever that woman had been. No, I won't, Sergeant, she said gently. Nobody ever tells the whole thing. That's the price. She turned back to her scope, and her voice went cold and level and final, the voice of a woman putting away everything human for the work that was coming. Now get back to your men and hold your flanks, because in about 90 seconds, this ridge is going to become the loudest place you have ever been in your life. And I'm going to need you to trust me completely. And not one of you is going to understand what I'm doing until it's already done. Donovan looked at her one more time. Then he crawled back to his platoon, to the 20 frightened, hopeful, exhausted men who were still alive because of a ghost who'd been hiding in plain sight. And he raised his voice over the growing roar of the enemy engines, and he told them the only thing that mattered. Alpha Platoon, Sergeant Marcus Donovan shouted. We hold this ridge, we hold it for her, and she holds it for us, and no matter what happens in the next few minutes, no matter what you see, you keep your positions and you trust the shooter. Do you understand me? And 20 voices, ragged and terrified and defiant, were roared back at him through the gunfire. Yes, Sergeant. Down in the valley, the armor began to move. The final assault was coming. And behind a boulder on the north side of Ember Ridge, a quiet girl who counted ammunition for a living pressed her cheek against a cold steel stock, breathed out slow, and began to count the shots she had left against the men she would have to kill to save them all. The engines came first, and then the world. Sergeant Marcus Donovan pressed his back against the boulder and felt the ground itself begin to shake, a low tremor that came up through the rock and into his teeth, and he knew without looking that the armor had committed. 3 vehicles at least, maybe more, hidden in the smoke, grinding up the lower slope, while behind them and around them, the infantry poured out of the tree line in a flood. He had seen a lot of ugly things in his life. He had never seen anything like the sight of an entire enemy force deciding all at once to stop being careful and simply come. Here they come! Whitfield screamed from Elena's position. Sergeant, here they come, all of them, everything. I see it, Donovan shouted back. Hold your fire. Hold. There is hold. Nobody fires until I call it. It went against every instinct in every man on that ridge. 20 rifles trembled behind 20 rocks. 20 fingers ached against triggers, and every soldier wanted to start shooting. Right now, wanted to pour everything they had into the oncoming wave, because doing something felt better than lying there and watching death climb toward them. But Donovan knew the truth of their situation with a terrible clarity. They had 3 magazines apiece. If they opened up now at this range, they'd burn through everything in 90 seconds and be reloading empty air when the enemy reached the top. Their only chance was discipline. Their only chance was to wait until the range was so close they could not miss, and to trust until then in the woman behind the boulder. Brooks, Donovan called. It's yours. Whatever you're going to do it now. Elena Brooks did not answer him. She had gone somewhere else. Donovan could see it even from where he crouched 20 feet away. Her body had settled into the rifle so completely that she seemed to have stopped in being a person and become part of the weapon, a still point in all the chaos, and her breathing had slowed to something Donovan couldn't even see. She was scanning, not the wave, not the mass of men flooding up the slope. She was looking past all of them, through them, searching for something in the churn of the assault that only she could see. Talk to me, Brooks, Whitfield whispered beside her, and his voice was shaking. What are you looking for? There's 100 of them. What do we? Quiet, Elena said. It was one word, soft, almost kind, and it shut Whitfield up completely. 9 seconds passed. Donovan counted them. 9 seconds while the armor closed the distance and the infantry screamed, and the whole face of the ridge came apart under enemy fire. 9 seconds, while a quiet girl looked for one man in a sea of men, and then Elena Brooks exhaled and said in a voice as calm as still water, There you are. The rifle fired. Donovan didn't see the target. He never saw her targets until after they fell. But he saw what happened next, and what happened next was the first thing that morning that made him truly begin to understand what she was. Down in the middle of the assault, moving behind the lead armored vehicle where he thought he was safe, a man in a different kind of gear than the soldiers around him. A man who had been pointing and gesturing and pulling the whole ragged wave into a single coordinated line, simply dropped. And the men nearest him, the ones who had been taking their timing and their courage from his hand signals and his shouted commands, faltered. Just for a moment. Just for a half second. But Donovan saw it ripple outward through the assault like a stone dropped in a pond, that half second of every soldier near the fallen commander suddenly not knowing what to do, suddenly having to think for themselves in the middle of a charge. And a charge is the one thing in the world that cannot survive men stopping to think. Field commander, Elena said, already cycling the action, already hunting for the next one. That's the man who was synchronizing the whole push. Watch what happens to their timing now. And Donovan watched, and it was exactly as she'd said. The 3 armored vehicles had been moving as one, advancing in a coordinated line, but now without the commander pulling them together, the one on the left surged ahead, while the one on the right lagged, and the gap between them opened, and the infantry that had been flowing smoothly between them bunched and split, and the whole beautiful, terrifying machine of the assault developed its first crack. It's working, Whitfield breathed. Sergeant, it's starting to work, Elena corrected without heat. One shot doesn't break an assault this size. It just makes the next shot matter more. She shifted her aim a fraction. Whitfield, the lead vehicle, left side. Tell me what you see on the front of it. Whitfield swung his scope. There's a slit, a window thing, glass, vision block. That's how the driver sees. That's how the whole vehicle sees where it's going. Elena's fingers settled on the trigger. An armored vehicle that can't see is just a very expensive rock. She fired, and 600 meters was nothing to her now. And the lead vehicle's forward vision block starred and went white, and the vehicle lurched, veering off its line, slewing sideways across the slope, as a blinded driver panicked, and the infantry advancing in its shadow suddenly had a 2-ton steel monster swinging toward them and had to scatter to keep from being crushed by their own armor. The whole left flank of the assault dissolved into confusion. On the ridge, a sound went up from Alpha Platoon that Donovan had never expected to hear that morning. It wasn't a cheer exactly. It was too raw for that, too disbelieving, the sound men make when they are watching something happen that their minds have not yet agreed is possible. Did you see that? Did you see what she did to that thing. She blinded a whole APC. Sergeant, who is she? You have to tell us who she is. Eyes forward, Donovan bellowed, because as much as his own heart was hammering with the same wild hope, he could see what the men couldn't in their excitement. The assault was cracking, but it was not broken. There were still 2 vehicles moving. There were still 80 infantry pushing up that slope, and the ones on the right flank hadn't faltered at all. And they were getting close now, close enough that Donovan could see individual faces, and a woman with a rifle and a shrinking bag of bullets could not stop all of them. Brooks, Donovan called, and he heard the edge in his own voice. The right flank, they're not slowing down. They're going to reach us in... I know, Elena said. I need you to hold them for 90 seconds. 90 seconds? Brooks, they're... 90 seconds, Sergeant. Give me the right flank for 90 seconds, and I'll give you the rest of the battle. Can your men hold the right for 90 seconds? Donovan looked at the right flank of his line at Sanchez, and 3 others crouched behind a spur of rock. And he looked at the mass of enemy soldiers bearing down on them, and every rational part of his mind said, 90 seconds was an eternity, said they'd be overrun in 30. But he'd watched this woman blind an armored vehicle and decapitate an assault with 4 shots, and something in him had crossed over into a place where he simply chose to believe her. Sanchez, he roared, right flank, open fire, controlled bursts, make every round count. You hold that spur for 90 seconds, no matter what Whitfield stays with Brooks. Everybody else wait the right, go, go, go. An Alpha platoon opened fire. The noise was staggering. After the strange, tense discipline of holding, the sudden eruption of 20 rifles felt like the ridge itself had begun to scream. And down on the slope, enemy soldiers began to fall. Not many, that they were still shooting wild and scared, but enough to make the right flank of the assault flinch, and slow enough to buy the seconds Elena had asked for. Donovan emptied half a magazine into the oncoming wave and dropped back behind his rock to reload, and shouted encouragement he didn't fully believe, and watched his men do the impossible thing he'd asked of them. Watch them hold. And behind the boulder, Elena Brooks ignored the right flank entirely. She had asked Donovan to hold it precisely so she wouldn't have to. Precisely so she could spend her attention and her dwindling rounds somewhere that mattered more. She had turned her rifle back to the center and the left back to the 2 remaining vehicles and the men who commanded them. And she was working with a speed now that Donovan, glancing back between his own bursts of fire, could barely follow. Second vehicle, she said to Whitfield, and fired, and the second APC's vision blocks shattered, and it too went blind and began to wander. Radio antenna, third vehicle, they're trying to call for their reserve. She fired again, and somewhere on the last moving vehicle, a whip antenna sheared off and fell, and whatever call for reinforcement the enemy had been trying to make died in the air. There's a man on the right of the tree line with binoculars and a radio. Forward observer. He's the one who's been directing what's left of their mortars. She fired a third time. Not anymore. Boss. 3 shots, maybe 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, Elena Brooks had blinded a second armored vehicle, cut the enemy's ability to call for help, and killed the man who could rain fire down on the ridge from beyond the tree line. Donovan watched it happen and felt something close to vertigo, because he was starting to see the shape of what she was doing, and the shape of it was monstrous in its efficiency. She wasn't fighting the battle in front of her. She was fighting the battle 3 moves ahead, killing the men whose deaths would matter in 30 seconds, in a minute. Dismantling not just the assault that was happening, but the assault that was about to happen, so that when the enemy reached for their next option, the next option was already gone. Sergeant, Sanchez's voice cut through the roar, ragged with strain. Right flank's buckling. They're too close. We can't. Donovan's stomach dropped. He whipped around and saw the enemy soldiers on the right flank surging. The last few yards, saw Sanchez and his 3 men being forced back off the spur, and he understood that the 90 seconds had run out and Elena hadn't finished, and now the whole thing was going to come apart at the seam. Brooks, he screamed. Right flank. Now they're through. Get down, Elena said. She said it quietly, and Donovan almost didn't hear it, but something in the flatness of it made him drop. Made every man near him drop, and it was a good thing they did, because Elena Brooks had swung the Barrett around to the right flank with a speed that should not have been possible for a weapon that heavy, and she fired not at the enemy soldiers themselves, but at something behind them, and the world came apart in a ball of fire. Donovan felt the heat of it wash over the boulder. When he lifted his head, the right flank of the assault was gone. What? He started. Their forward soldiers were moving up alongside a vehicle carrying spare mortar rounds. Elena said it, already turning back to the center, already hunting the next target as if she had not just erased a dozen men in a single shot. I've been watching it climb the slope for 2 minutes, waiting for it to get close enough to their own people to matter. It just did. She worked the action. The brass rang against the rock. That's how you kill 12 men with 1 bullet, Sergeant. You don't shoot the men, you shoot the thing they're standing next to. For a moment, Donovan couldn't speak. None of them could. The entire right flank of the enemy, assault flank that had been about to overrun them, had simply ceased to exist, and the survivors were pulling back down the slope in a stumbling, panicked retreat, and the ridge that had been about to fall was impossibly still theirs. "Sanchez," Donovan managed, "you still with me?" "I'm here, Sergeant," came the shaken voice. "I'm here. I don't know what just happened, but I'm here." "She happened," Whitfield said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice now, something Donovan didn't like, because reverence in the middle of a battle was a way of forgetting that you still had to fight. "She happened, Sanchez. Our supply clerk just happened." "Focus," Elena said, and the single word cut through the platoon's dawning awe like cold water. "It's not over. Look at them. Look." They looked. The assault had been shattered. That much was true. The armor was blind and wandering. The command structure was in ruins. The right flank was ash. But down in the valley in the tree line, Donovan could see figures moving with a different kind of energy now, and he realized with a sinking feeling that the enemy was not routing. Not yet. They were reorganizing. Somebody down there was pulling the broken pieces back together, was grabbing terrified soldiers by their collars and forcing them back into a line, was salvaging something from the disaster Elena had made. And Donovan understood that whoever that somebody was, he was the most dangerous man on the field. "They've still got a commander," Elena said, confirming Donovan's thought before he could voice it. "Somewhere back in those trees. Somebody with rank and nerve, somebody who's watched me take apart his whole plan and hasn't panicked. He's the reason they haven't broken completely." She scanned the tree line slowly, methodically, her eye moving across the shadows between the trunks. "He's staying hidden. He's smart. He's learned that the moment he shows himself to give an order, he dies. So he's giving orders some other way, runners maybe, or he's using terrain to shield himself while he directs." She paused. "I need to find him, Sergeant. As long as he's alive, they'll keep coming, and I'm running out of rounds to make them stop." "How many do you have left?" Elena Brooks was silent for a moment. Then she said, "6. 6. Donovan let the number sit in his chest like a stone. 6 rounds in an enemy force that even now was clawing itself back together for another push in a hidden commander somewhere in 1,000 acres of tree line that she couldn't find and couldn't kill. "Then make them count," Donovan said, because there was nothing else to say. "I intend to," Elena said, "but I can't spend them until I find him. If I fire at soldiers, I kill soldiers and change nothing, and end up with an empty rifle and a live commander who just walks his men over us. I have to wait. I have to find the one man whose death ends this, and I have to have a round left when I find him." She settled back down behind the scope. "So I'm going to do the hardest thing there is, Sergeant. I'm going to hold my fire while men climb this hill to kill us, and I'm going to trust you to hold the line with rifles while I hunt for the one shot that matters. Can you do that? Can you hold without me for as long as it takes?" And there it was. The whole terrible weight of it handed to Donovan in a single question. She was asking him to fight the close battle, the desperate, screaming hand-to-hand battle of a ridge under assault, with nothing but exhausted men and dwindling ammunition, while she lay silent beside him, refusing to help saving her 6 precious rounds for a target she might never even find. She was asking him to bleed while she waited. "Yeah," Donovan said, "we can hold." He didn't know if it was true, but he said it, and he meant it, and he crawled back to his men to make it true. What came next in the timeline Donovan would later try and fail to reconstruct for the investigators was the worst 11 minutes of the entire engagement. The enemy came again, not in the clean, coordinated wave of before, but in ragged, furious surges, small groups of soldiers rushing the slope wherever they saw a gap. An Alpha platoon met them with rifle fire and grenades, and when the ammunition ran low with whatever they had left, Donovan lost 2 more men in those 11 minutes. He would carry their faces the rest of his life. A private named Ochoa took a round through the throat while he was reloading, and Donovan was 3 feet away and could do nothing but hold the boy's hand while he went. A radio tech named Bell, who had never fired his weapon in anger before that morning, stood up to throw a grenade at an enemy soldier who'd gotten too close and was cut down before the grenade left his hand, and the grenade rolled back, and Donovan had to drag 2 men clear before it went. And through all of it, Elena Brooks did not fire. Donovan could feel his men beginning to break, not from the enemy, but from her stillness. They could hear the silence of her rifle in the middle of their dying, and they didn't understand it, and understanding turned to resentment faster than Donovan would have believed. "Why isn't she shooting?" Sanchez shouted. At one point, his face streaked with blood and grime, his eyes wild. "Sergeant, we're dying up here. Why isn't she shooting? Tell her to shoot." "She's got 6 rounds, Sanchez," Donovan shouted back. 6, she's saving them. "For what? For what? We're getting slaughtered, and she's just lying there. Tell her to. She knows what she's doing." "Does she? Does she?" And Sanchez's voice cracked on the words, and Donovan understood that the man wasn't really angry at Elena. He was angry at the whole impossible situation, angry at Ochoa dying and Bell dying, and the awful helplessness of it, and he needed somewhere to put the anger, and she was the easiest place. "How do you know she's not just waiting to save her own?" "Sanchez." Donovan grabbed him by the vest and pulled his face close. "That woman blew a hole in their right flank and killed their commander and blinded 2 vehicles while you and I were reloading. She has kept every single one of us alive this morning. So you are going to get back on that line, and you are going to trust her, because trusting her is the only reason any of us are going to see tomorrow. Do you hear me?" Sanchez stared at him, breathing hard, and then something in him deflated, and he nodded, and he went back to the line. Donovan crawled to Elena's position. She hadn't moved. She was still scanning the tree line, patient and terrible, and Donovan looked at the 6 shapes of her remaining rounds in the pouch at her side and felt his patience fraying. "Brooks," he said low so the men wouldn't hear, "I've got 2 dead in the last 10 minutes. My men are asking why you won't shoot. I've been telling them to trust you. But I need you to tell me the truth right now, because I'm spending their faith, and I need to know I'm not spending it on nothing. Can you find this commander? Or are we all lying here waiting for a shot that's never coming?" For a long moment, Elena didn't answer. And then, without taking her eye from the scope, she said something that Donovan was not expecting. Something that changed the color of the whole morning. "I know who he is," she said quietly. Donovan went still. "What?" "The commander. In the trees, I know who he is." She let out a slow breath. "I've known since the second shot when I killed his field commander and watched how he reacted. Or how he didn't react. Most men panic when their subordinate dies in front of their whole force. This one just adjusted, cold, efficient. I've only seen a handful of men run a battle that way." Her voice dropped even lower. "I served against one of them, a long time ago. Different war, different name on the flag, but the same hands running the show." She paused. "His name is Von Reyes, and he's not supposed to be here, Sergeant. He's not supposed to be anywhere near this part of the world. Which means this ridge, this whole thing, your quiet little routine defensive hold, was never routine at all. Somebody sent Reyes here for a reason, and I think the reason might be me." Donovan's blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" 7 years ago, I was part of an operation that ended a man Reyes worked for," Elena said. "Ended him permanently. It was clean. It was supposed to be untraceable. Nobody was ever supposed to know a shadow line operator was involved, let alone which one." She was quiet for a moment. "But Reyes is the kind of man who spends years pulling threads. And I've spent the last 7 years wondering if one of those threads ever led back to me. I think I just got my answer. I think he found out I was embedded in a logistics rotation, and I think he arranged for that rotation to end up on a ridge in the middle of nowhere. And I think he brought 90 men to make sure that this time the ghost died with everyone around her, so it would just look like one more unit lost in one more bad morning." Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. "You asked me why this stopped being routine, that's why. I'm the reason all of you are up here. I'm the reason they're dying. Ochoa, Bell. They died because of a war I fought before any of them enlisted." Donovan didn't know what to say. The whole shape of the morning had just rearranged itself in his mind, and he hated the new shape. hated that these men had been fed into a trap meant for a woman most of them had never even spoken to. "That's not on you," he finally said. "You didn't send them here. You didn't pull the trigger on them. He did." "I know whose finger's on the trigger, Sergeant," Elena said, "but I also know who they came for." She was silent for a beat. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that Reyes knows I'm up here and he knows I have to be running low, and he's not going to make a mistake and show himself. He's going to keep feeding soldiers up this hill 30 at a time until I either run out of rounds or run out of men to protect. He's patient. He's been patient for 7 years to get here." Her jaw tightened just barely, the only crack in her calm Donovan had seen all morning. "But so have I." "So what do? We make him impatient," Elena said, and she told Donovan her plan. It was, Donovan thought as he listened, either the smartest thing he had ever heard or the most insane, and he genuinely could not tell which. Elena's reasoning went like this. Reyes would never expose himself as long as he believed he was winning, as long as he believed all he had to do was keep grinding the ridge down. So they had to make him believe he was losing. They had to make him believe that something had gone so wrong, so catastrophically, that he needed to come forward and take direct control to save it, because a commander like Reyes could tolerate his soldiers dying, but he could not tolerate his plan falling apart in a way only his own hands could fix. "You're going to give me an opening," Elena said. "You and your men are going to fake a breakout. You're going to make it look like the Alpha platoon has decided to stop holding and start running like the line has finally broken, and we're trying to flee down the far side of the ridge. When Reyes sees that, he's going to think he's won. He's going to think all he has to do is spring his reserve and cut off the retreat and finish us in the open. And to do that, to time it right, he's going to have to come forward to where he can see the far slope." Her eye was pressed to the scope, unblinking. "And for about 4 seconds while he's giving that order, he's going to be exposed." "You want us to fake a rout?" Donovan said slowly. "You want me to convince 90 enemy soldiers that my platoon is running when we're outnumbered 4-1, and any real breakout gets us all killed in the open?" "I want you to convince one man," Elena said. "Reyes. The rest of them don't matter. If Reyes believes it, the rest of them will believe it because they take their reality from him. Sell it to Reyes and the whole enemy force will believe Alpha Platoon is broken, and they'll surge forward to finish you. And in the chaos of that surge, their commander will come forward to direct the kill." She finally looked at Donovan, and her flat gray eyes held his. "And I'll have 1 round waiting for him. Just 1. That's all I need. 1 round, 1 man, and this entire battle ends before your fake rout ever becomes a real one. And if he doesn't come forward, if he's too smart, if he directs it from cover, then your men are exposed in the open, and I've spent an opening I can't get back, and we probably all die," Elena said with the flat honesty Donovan had come to recognize as the only kind she had. "It's a gamble, Sergeant. I won't pretend it isn't, but it's a better gamble than lying here letting him grind us down 30 at a time until I'm empty and you're out of men. This way, at least, we get to choose the moment. And a man like Reyes, a man who's waited 7 years and come all this way to personally make sure the ghost dies when he thinks the trap is finally closing, when he thinks he's about to get the thing he came for." She turned back to her scope. "He'll come forward. I'd stake my life on it. And that's exactly what I'm doing." Donovan looked back at his men, what was left of them. 17 now, maybe 18, exhausted and bloodied and nearly out of ammunition. And he tried to imagine asking them to run out into the open on the word of a woman most of them still didn't trust, based on a plan that hinged on the psychology of an enemy commander. None of them could even see. It was madness, and it was the only chance they had. "Okay," Donovan said. "Tell me exactly how you want to run it." They ran it in the space of 90 seconds because Elena said any longer, and Reyes would smell. It would sense the pause, would understand that a genuinely breaking unit doesn't take its time. Donovan gathered his men in a huddle behind the rocks and told them the plan in short, hard sentences, and he watched the disbelief cross their faces, and he watched Sanchez open his mouth to argue, and then close it again when he saw Donovan's expression. "I know how it sounds," Donovan said. "I know exactly how it sounds. You're going to break cover and run for the far slope, and you're going to sell it like your lives depend on it, because they do, but not the way you think. You're not actually running. You're going 20 yards to the low ground, behind the second rock spur, and then you're going flat and you're taking cover and you are waiting. The run is bait. It's a lie we're telling one man. And when he takes the bait, Brooks ends this. You understand me? 20 yards, then down, then wait. Anybody who actually keeps running then is a dead man, and worse, they blow the whole thing. 20 yards, then down. And if he doesn't take the bait, Sanchez asked. But it was a different kind of question than before. Not resentful, scared but ready. Then we find out we're braver than we thought, Donovan said. On my mark, everybody breathe, everybody with me. He looked at each of them, 17 faces, and he loved them all in that moment with a fierceness that frightened him. We've held this ridge for over an hour against odds nobody would believe. We hold it 30 more seconds. That's all. 30 more seconds and one shot and we go home. He raised his hand. On my mark. Behind the boulder, Elena Brooks had gone completely still. She had chosen her sector of the tree line, the one place Reyes would have to come forward to see the far slope. And she was watching it with the total hollow patience of a woman who had waited 7 years for exactly this. She had 1 round chambered. 5 in reserve she would never need if this worked and would desperately need if it didn't. Her breathing had stopped. Her heart, Donovan would have sworn, had stopped. She had become the rifle, and the rifle had become a single question aimed at a single point in the trees. And the question was, are you there? And the whole battle, all of it, every man who had lived and died on Ember Ridge that morning hung on the answer. Brooks, Donovan said very quietly. You ready? Send them, Elena breathed. Donovan dropped his hand. Now, he roared. Go, 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 break and run. An Alpha platoon exploded out of cover. They sold it. God, they sold it. 17 men burst from behind the rocks and sprinted for the far slope in a stumbling, screaming, chaotic mass, throwing away the disciplined, firing positions they'd held for an hour. And to anyone watching from the tree line, it looked exactly like what it was pretending to be a unit that had finally cracked a line, that had finally broken a platoon, abandoning its ground in the blind animal panic of men who have decided to stop fighting and start running. Enemy fire chased them across the open ground. Donovan felt rounds crack past him. He heard someone cry out, prayed it was a cell and not a hit, and kept screaming at his men to run, run, run 20 yards down. And down in the tree line, Colonel Von Reyes watched the American line break, and he smiled the same smile he'd smiled at dawn. He had them. After all of it, after the ghost and her impossible rifle and the hour she'd cost him, and the men she'd killed, he finally had them. The line was broken. The Americans were running. All he had to do now was spring the reserve he'd been holding on the far flank and close the door, catch them in the open and finish it. He'd have to time it precisely. The reserve couldn't see the far slope from where they were staged. He'd have to move up himself just to the edge of the tree line, just for a moment, just long enough to see the runners and signal the reserve to spring the trap at exactly the right instant. Just for 4 seconds, Reyes stepped forward to the edge of the trees, raised his hand to signal. His reserve opened his mouth to give the order that would end the Battle of Ember Ridge, and in the half-second before he could speak, some old instinct, some cold animal warning that had kept him alive through 30 years of war, whispered to him that the running had been too clean, that the panic had been too neat, that a truly broken unit does not break all at once and all in the same direction, and that a woman who had spent an hour proving she was 3 moves ahead of him would not at the very end suddenly become the kind of soldier who could be fooled by something so simple as men pretending to run. His eyes went to the north boulders, and for one frozen instant, across 680 meters of smoke and gunfire and 7 years of patience, Colonel Von Reyes looked directly into the scope of the woman he had crossed the world to kill, and he understood in the final complete second of his life that he had gotten it exactly backward. He had not sprung a trap. He had walked into one. The route was the bait, he was the target, and the quiet girl behind the rifle had never, not for one moment of that entire morning, been the one being hunted. Elena Brooks let out the last of her breath, and in the stillness at the bottom of it, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that she had trained 7 years to find, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired, and 680 meters away, Colonel Von Reyes died with his hand still raised in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. The signal he'd been about to give never came, and the reserve he'd been holding on the far flank waited for an order from a man who would never give another order again. And in that terrible pause, the entire enemy assault simply stopped, the way a body stops when the heart quits, still standing, still armed, but already dead and not yet aware of it. Donovan, flat on his belly behind the second rock spur where he'd thrown himself, and 17 men after the 20-yard sprint didn't see Reyes fall. He didn't see anything but dirt in the boots of the man beside him and the gray sky above. But he heard the shot, that single enormous crack of the Barrett rolling across the ridge, and then he heard something he had not heard all morning. He heard the enemy stop shooting. "What's happening?" Sanchez hissed beside him. "Sergeant, what's happening? Why'd they stop?" Donovan didn't answer because he didn't know, because he was afraid to hope. He lifted his head slow, an inch at a time, and looked back toward the North Boulders where Elena Brooks lay, and he saw her already working the action, already scanning, already hunting for whatever came next. And he called out to her across the open ground in a voice that cracked with everything he was afraid to feel. "Brooks, did you get him? Brooks, talk to me." For a second she didn't answer, and Donovan's heart climbed into his throat. Then Elena Brooks said in a voice as flat and level as it had been all morning, with not one thread of triumph in it, "Reyes is down, center of mass, then the head as he fell. He's not getting up." She kept scanning. "Now we find out if I was right about him being the only thing holding them together." They didn't have to wait long. Down in the valley, the enemy force began to come apart. Not all at once. First, it was just a hesitation, a ripple of confusion spreading outward from the tree line where their commander had fallen. 100 soldiers suddenly realizing that no orders were coming, that the voice that had driven them up this hill 3 times had gone silent, that the man who'd promised them this would be quick and clean had just been erased across 600 meters by a ghost they couldn't even see. Donovan watched a knot of enemy soldiers on the near slope stop dead and look back toward the trees, and he watched them wait, and he watched the waiting turn into something else. "They're breaking," Whitfield breathed from Elena's position, his scope on the valley. "Sergeant, look at them. They don't know what to do. They're just standing there." "Not yet," Elena said. "Not quite. There's still a reserve on the far flank that never got the order to spring. 30 men, maybe more, and whoever's leading them is trying to figure out if he's in command now. Watch the far flank. If somebody over there decides to take charge, this isn't over. If nobody does." She didn't finish because on the far flank, somebody tried. Donovan saw a figure moving among the staged reserve, gesturing, shouting, trying to pull the confused soldiers into a coherent push, trying to be the thing Reyes had been. And for a moment it looked like it might work. The reserve began to move, began to form up, began to turn toward the ridge with the momentum of 30 fresh soldiers who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the North Boulders. "Brooks," Donovan said, and there was warning in it. "I see him," Elena said. "New commander, trying to inherit the battle." She was already adjusting. "He's about to learn why nobody wants that job." The rifle fired. On the far flank, the figure who had been trying to become Reyes dropped mid-gesture, and the 30 soldiers he'd almost pulled together watched their second commander in 90 seconds die in front of them, and whatever fragile courage had been building in them shattered completely. That was the moment the enemy force stopped being an army and became a mob. Donovan watched it happen, watched the exact instant when 100 trained soldiers collectively decided that no ridge in the world was worth this, that whatever was up in those rocks was not a thing men were meant to fight, and they broke. They ran, not in an orderly withdrawal, not in a fighting retreat. They ran the way men run when terror has finally beaten discipline, throwing down anything that slowed them. Some of them dropping their weapons, streaming back down the slope and into the tree line. And away a full rout. 100 men fleeing from 20 from one, from a quiet girl with a rifle, and Donovan realized with a jolt almost no rounds left. "Cease fire," Elena said quietly. "Let them go. Don't chase them. A cornered force reforms. A fleeing force just keeps fleeing as long as you let it run." She lowered her cheek from the stock just slightly, just enough that Donovan understood she believed the worst was over. "Sergeant, get your men up. Get them into hard cover in case I'm wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong. I think it's done." Donovan rose to his knees behind the rock spur, and he looked down the slope at the backs of the fleeing enemy, and he looked at the bodies scattered across the ground that Elena Brooks had made, and he looked at his own 17 men, filthy and bloodied and alive, staring at the routing enemy with expressions of pure disbelief. And something broke open in his chest that he'd been holding shut since 6:42 that morning. "They're running," Sanchez said. His voice was very small. "Sergeant, they're running. We won. And then his voice cracked completely, and the hardened corporal who'd been screaming at Elena to shoot 10 minutes ago put his face in his hands, wept right there in the dirt, because that was the only thing a human body could do with what they had just survived. Donovan let him. He let all of them feel it. He'd learned long ago that you don't stop men from breaking down after a thing like this. You only make sure they break down somewhere safe. He moved among them, a hand on a shoulder here, a quiet word there, taking account, taking stock, doing the awful arithmetic of survival. 17 alive of the 17 who'd faked the rout. 2 more they'd get to, now wounded but breathing, that they'd pulled into cover during the fight. Kowalski, who'd taken shrapnel in the leg an hour ago and had somehow kept feeding rounds to the men around him the whole time. That made 20. 20 of the 29 who'd walked up the ridge at dawn. 9 dead. 9 men who would not walk back down. Donovan closed his eyes for a moment against the weight of it, and then he opened them because grief was a luxury for later, and right now he had 20 living men to keep living. Whitfield, he called. Get on the net. Keep trying comms. The jamming might lift now that their command's gone. We need a medevac, and we need it yesterday. Kowalski, Peterson, and Ruiz can't wait much longer. He turned toward the boulders. Brooks, what's our situation? Are they gone, or are they going to reorganize down there and come back? Elena didn't answer right away. Donovan looked over and saw her still lying behind the rifle, still watching the tree line through her scope, and something in her stillness had changed. During the battle, her stillness had been the stillness of a coiled spring of a predator waiting to strike. This was different. This was the stillness of a woman who had just been holding up something impossibly heavy and had finally carefully set it down, and was now realizing she wasn't sure her arms still worked. Brooks, Donovan said, again quieter, and he crossed the open ground to her, and he knelt beside her to, hey, talk to me. They're gone, Elena said. Her voice was steady, but Donovan was close enough now to see her hands, and her hands were not steady. They were trembling, fine, deep tremor. She couldn't stop the tremor of a body finally releasing. 7 hours, 7 years of held tension all at once. They won't come back. Not today. A route that complete doesn't reform in an afternoon. You'd need a new command structure resupply and the nerve to face whatever's on this ridge again. And they don't have any of the 3. She was quiet for a beat. It's over, Sergeant. You can breathe. How many rounds did you have left? Donovan asked. He didn't know why he asked it. He just needed to know. Elena reached down to the pouch at her side, and she opened it, and she looked inside, and then she showed him. 3, she said. 3 rounds. She had broken the entire final assault, killed. Reyes killed the man who tried to replace him and routed 100 soldiers with a rifle that had held at the start of it 6 bullets. She had spent exactly half of what she had, and she had done it with such precision, such terrible economy, that she'd ended the Battle of Ember Ridge with 3 rounds still in her pouch and every man of Alpha Platoon who could have survived surviving. Donovan looked at the 3 brass casings gleaming in her palm, and he looked at her trembling hands, and he looked at her face, which was still perfectly calm, still perfectly flat, and he understood with a sudden aching clarity that the calm was not strength. The calm was the wound. Whatever Shadowline had done to Elena Brooks in 7 years, it had taught her to feel nothing on the outside, no matter what was tearing loose on the inside. And the trembling hands were the only part of her that hadn't gotten the message. Brooks, he said gently, you did it. You saved every one of us. You know that, right? I did what needed to be done, Elena said. And Donovan heard the flatness in it, the practiced emptiness, and something in him rebelled against it because he had just watched this woman perform a miracle, and she was talking about it like a janitor talking about mopping a floor. No, he said. No, you don't get to do that, not with me, not after this morning. He put his hand on her shoulder and he felt the tremor running through her whole body, and he made his voice as steady and as true as he could. I have been doing this for 11 years, Elena. 11 years, and I have never seen anything like what you did on this ridge today. You didn't just do what needed to be done. You did something that shouldn't have been possible. 20 of us are alive who should all be dead. And that's not the rifle, and it's not luck. It's you, so you can tell the investigators whatever flat thing you want. But you and me right now, we're going to be honest with each other. You saved us. Say it. You saved us. For a long moment, Elena Brooks was silent. And then something moved in her face, something that hadn't been there all morning, something that broke through the flat, gray calm for just an instant. And Donovan saw underneath it, saw the exhaustion and the grief and the crushing, unbearable weight of a woman who had spent 7 years being a weapon, and had almost forgotten she was ever a person. And he saw in that instant that she was much younger than he'd thought and much more alone than any human being should ever have to be. They died because of me, Elena said. Her voice was barely audible. The 9. Ochoa, Bell, the others. Reyes came here for me, Sergeant. I told you that. He crossed the world to kill a ghost, and he brought 90 men to do it, and he pointed them at a ridge full of people who never even knew my real name. The tremor in her hands got worse. I can tell you I saved 20, but I can't stop counting the 9. And the 9 only died because I existed. Because 7 years ago I did my job so well that a man spent the rest of his life hunting me, and he finally found me here in your platoon, in your quiet little defensive hold. She looked at Donovan, and for the first time all morning, her flat gray eyes were not flat at all. So don't tell me I saved everyone. I know exactly who I saved, and I know exactly who I got killed. Donovan was quiet for a moment. He'd been a sergeant long enough to know that there was no argument that would fix this, that grief like hers couldn't be talked out of a person, that the only thing worse than letting her carry it would be pretending she shouldn't. So he didn't argue. He just told her the truth as he understood it. You didn't send Reyes here, he said. You didn't put those soldiers on that slope. You didn't fire the artillery that killed the first men we lost before you ever picked up that rifle. He did that. All of it. Every death on this ridge belongs to the man who planned it, and you just put a bullet through his skull at 680 meters. He tightened his hand on her shoulder. You want to carry the 9, I can't stop you. I'll carry them too. But you carry them as the woman who avenged them and saved the rest, not as the woman who killed them. Because that second woman doesn't exist. That's a story that Shadowline taught you to tell about yourself, and it's a lie. And I think somewhere in there you know it's a lie. Elena Brooks stared at him, and then slowly she looked away back down the slope at the emptied battlefield and the fleeing enemy long gone into the trees. And Donovan didn't know if his words had landed or not, but he knew he'd meant them, and he knew he'd keep meaning them, and that would have to be enough for now. Sergeant! Whitfield's voice cut across the ridge, high and urgent. Sergeant, comms are back. The jamming's lifted. I've got command. Oh, thank God they're sending a QRF and 2 medevac birds. ETA 30 minutes. A ragged sound went up from the platoon relief, so profound it was almost pain, and Donovan closed his eyes and let it wash through him. 30 minutes. They could hold 30 minutes. They could hold 30 years now, after what they'd already held. Tell them we've got 3 urgent casualties and 9 KIA, Donovan called back. Tell them the ridge is secure. Tell them, he paused. He looked at Elena Brooks at the rifle she was already methodically beginning to disassemble, breaking it back down into the components that would go back into the locked case, making the impossible weapon disappear the way she'd made herself disappear for 7 years. Tell them we held, he finished. Just tell them Alpha Platoon held. The next 30 minutes were the strangest of the entire morning, and in some ways the hardest, because the fighting was over, and there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting gave the men time to feel everything they'd been too busy to feel. Donovan moved among them, checking wounds, checking hearts, and he watched 20 men come apart and put themselves back together in 20 different ways. Some wept. Some laughed the wild, unhinged laughter of survival. Some just sat and stared at nothing, seeing again and again the things they'd seen. Sanchez sat next to Ochoa's body and would not leave it, held the dead boy's hand and talked to him quietly, and Donovan let him because Sanchez needed to say whatever he was saying, and Ochoa was past caring, but somehow it mattered anyway. And through all of it, the platoon kept looking at Elena Brooks. They didn't know how to look at her. That was the thing Donovan noticed moving among them. An hour ago, she'd been invisible to them, the supply clerk, the quiet girl, a piece of furniture in their unit. Now she was something else entirely, and they didn't have a word for it, and it made them awkward and reverent and a little afraid. They watched her clean the rifle and pack it away, and they whispered to each other, and Donovan caught fragments of it. 7 years, she said. 7 years, and we never... I sat next to her at chow like 100 times. 100 times. I never... You think that's even her real name, Brooks? You think command even knows what she... Cut it out, Donovan said, passing them, not unkindly. She's still your platoon mate. She's still the woman who saved your lives. Treat her like it. But he understood their confusion because he felt it too. He kept glancing at Elena as she worked, and he kept trying to reconcile the woman in front of him, small and quiet and methodically stowing her gear, with the woman who'd conducted a battle like a symphony an hour before, and he couldn't do it. They were the same person, and they were not the same person. And Donovan suspected that living inside that contradiction, being both of those women and never being allowed to be just one, was its own kind of slow torture. He crossed to her once more as she was locking the case. "They're going to have questions," he said quietly. "When the QRF gets here, when we get back, Command's going to want to know how a logistics private with a Barrett broke a company-strength assault. They're going to want to know a lot of things." "They won't get the answers," Elena said. She didn't look up from the lock. "People will come, Sergeant, quiet people. Before Command ever finishes its report, they'll take the case and they'll take the record and they'll take me, and in about a week, this whole morning is going to have a very different official version than the one you lived through. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." She snapped the lock shut and finally looked at him. "You need to understand that. What happened here today, the true version, the one where your supply clerk was a shadow line operator who Reyes crossed the world to kill, that version is going to disappear. The report's going to say Alpha Platoon repelled the assault through, I don't know, superior positioning and small arms fire and the sacrifice of 9 brave soldiers. And it's going to be true enough that nobody questions it and false enough that nobody ever knows what really happened up here." Donovan stared at her. "That's not right. The men, my men, they deserve to have this on the record. What they did up here, holding that line, faking that route, they earned that. They earned the truth." "They earned it," Elena agreed. "They won't get it, and neither will you." She stood the case in her hand, and she was so small standing there, and so tired and so completely alone in a way Donovan was only beginning to grasp. "That's the price, Sergeant, not the fighting. The fighting's almost the easy part. The price is that you do the impossible thing and you save the people who can't be saved, and then you watch it get erased. And you carry the true version alone for the rest of your life because there's no one you're allowed to tell." Something flickered in her eyes. "I've been paying that price for 7 years. I'm sorry, you were going to have to pay a little of it now, but you will. That's what it costs to have been up here today." Donovan didn't know what to say because he could tell she was right. He'd been in the service long enough to know how certain things got handled, how certain truths got smoothed over and filed away, and he could feel already the shape of the official silence that was going to swallow this morning whole. "Then I'll carry it," he said finally. "The true version. I'll carry it for all of them. And Brooks," he stopped, made himself say it, "you won't be carrying it alone anymore. You've got at least one other person who knows exactly what happened up here. That doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't fix anything. But it's not nothing either. It's one person. It's me." Elena Brooks looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind her flat gray eyes. Something Donovan couldn't name, something old and tired, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit grateful. "That's not nothing," she agreed quietly. "No, that's not nothing." The wind moved across the ridge, and somewhere in the distance, faint but growing, came the first thin sound of helicopter rotors. "That's the birds," Whitfield called. "Sergeant, that's the birds. They're inbound." Donovan rose to his feet, and he looked at his platoon, at the 20 living and the 9 dead at the ridge they'd held against everything the world had thrown at them. And then he looked down at Elena Brooks, still sitting, still holding that locked case that contained the only proof of what she really was. "Come on," he said, and he offered her his hand. "Let's get you up. The men should see you standing when the QRF arrives. Whatever the official report says, whatever gets erased, I want every one of them to have this one image burned into their heads for the rest of their lives." Their supply clerk on her feet at the top of the ridge she saved. "Let them have that. Nobody can erase what a man remembers seeing with his own eyes." For a moment, Elena didn't move. And then slowly she reached up and took his hand, and Donovan pulled her to her feet, and the two of them stood together at the top of Ember Ridge as the sound of the rotors grew louder. And one by one, the men of Alpha Platoon turned to look at them, and one by one, without a word, without an order, they rose to their feet as well. 20 exhausted, bloodied, broken living men, standing up on a ridge that should have been their grave, looking at the small, quiet woman who had refused to let it be. Sanchez was the first to salute. He did it clumsily, his hands shaking, tears still wet on his filthy face, but he did it, and he held it, and then Whitfield was saluting, and then Kowalski propped against a rock with his ruined leg, and then all of them. Every man who could lift an arm, the whole surviving strength of Alpha Platoon standing at attention and saluting a woman whose real name They would never know, whose true story would be erased within the week, who had appeared out of nowhere with a rifle nobody knew existed and held back an army so that they could live. Elena Brooks looked at them, and for one moment, one single moment, the flat gray calm cracked all the way through, and Sergeant Marcus Donovan watched something rise up behind her eyes that she had clearly not let herself feel in a very, very long time. And her jaw tightened, and her throat worked, and she did not cry because whatever Shadowline had done to her had taken even that, but she came closer to it in that moment than Donovan suspected she had come in years. And then quietly she brought her own hand up and she returned their salute. The helicopters crested the ridgeline, their rotors thundering, and the morning that had begun with an enemy colonel smiling as he ordered a massacre ended with 20 men and one impossible woman standing together at the top of a ridge that the whole world would soon be told had never been anything more than a routine defensive hold. The helicopters came down like judgment, and the men who stepped off them were not medics. Donovan noticed it in the first 3 seconds. 2 birds had crested the ridge, and one was clearly a medevac Red Cross plane on its side crew already spilling out with litters and bags. But the second bird was wrong. It was matte and unmarked, and the men who dropped from it wore no unit patches, no rank he could read, no name tapes, and they moved with a quiet, coordinated economy that Donovan had only ever seen in one other person that morning, and she was standing right beside him. "They're here for you," he said quietly. "They're here for this case," Elena Brooks corrected just as quietly. "I'm just the part of the package that can walk. Don't make this a scene, Sergeant. Please. Whatever you're about to feel, whatever you're about to want to do, don't. It won't help me. It'll only hurt your men." She hadn't moved. She was still standing exactly where she'd risen, the locked case at her feet. Now her hands loose at her sides, watching the unmarked men approach with the flat, resigned calm of a woman watching weather she couldn't change. This is how it always ends. Every time. They arrive, they collect, they erase. I've done this before. Let me do it clean. But Donovan's men had noticed too. He watched it ripple through them the same way the enemy's confusion had rippled after Reyes fell. The medevac crew was already working, already getting Kowalski and Peterson and Ruiz onto litters, and that was good. That was right. But the unmarked men had walked straight past the wounded, straight past the dead, straight past every soldier who needed them, and they were walking toward Elena and Alpha Platoon, understood what that meant before any words were spoken. 20 men who had just watched this woman save their lives, who had just saluted her at the top of the ridge, now watched strangers in blank uniforms come to take her away like a piece of equipment. Sanchez stepped in front of her. He did it without thinking, Donovan could tell. Did it the way a man steps in front of a car before Hepburn has caught up within a body. He was still filthy with Ochoa's blood still shaking, but he planted himself between Elena and the approaching men, and his voice when it came was raw and dangerous. "Where do you think you're going?" The lead man stopped. He was older gray at the temples, with a face that gave away absolutely nothing. He looked at Sanchez the way you'd look at a chair that had gotten in your way. "Stand down, Corporal," he said, mild, almost bored. "This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me." Sanchez laughed, and it was an ugly cracking sound. "She just saved my life. She just saved all our lives. 9 of us are dead, and she's the only reason it's not 29, and you walk up here like she's a crate you came to pick up. It concerns me. It concerns every man on this ridge." Behind him, the rest of the platoon was moving, drifting into a loose wall between the unmarked men and Elena, not raising weapons, not quite, but making their bodies into a statement. Whitfield, then 2 others, then more. 20 exhausted soldiers closing ranks around the woman most of them hadn't even been able to look at an hour ago, and Donovan felt his chest tighten at the sight of it because there was something in it that was almost holy and almost about to become a catastrophe. "Sergeant Donovan." The gray-haired man's eyes found Donovan's, and they held a quiet warning. "Get your men under control. You know what this is. You know how it works. Don't let them do something that ends careers or worse over a thing that's already decided." And that was the moment. Donovan felt it, the fork in the path. He could give the order. He could tell his men to stand down, and they would because they were his men, and they trusted him, and Elena would be collected, and the case would be taken, and this morning would begin its slow disappearance into the official silence, clean, just like she'd asked. Or he could not give it and see what happened and maybe make everything worse for everyone, including her. He looked at Elena. She met his eyes and she gave the smallest shake of her head, and her expression said clearly, "Don't. Let me go clean. Don't make them pay for me." And Donovan understood in that moment that letting her go clean was exactly the thing she'd been trained to want, exactly the thing 7 years had ground into her. The reflex to minimize, to disappear, to cost no one anything, to slip out of every life she touched without leaving a mark. And he understood that if he gave that order now, if he made his men stand aside and let her be collected like cargo, he'd be teaching her one more time the lesson she'd already learned too well. The lesson that she didn't matter, that she was disposable, that the world would use her and erase her, and no one would ever stand in the way. So he didn't give the order. "No," Donovan said. The gray-haired man's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Sergeant, I I said no." Donovan stepped forward past his men, and he put himself directly in front of the unmarked man, closer than was polite, and he kept his voice low and level so that it wouldn't sound like a threat and would somehow be far more of one. "You want the case, take the case. I don't care about the case. But you're not walking her off this ridge like she's a piece of gear. And you're not doing it in the next 5 minutes while my wounded are still being loaded and my dead are still lying where they fell. She stays until the last of my men is on a bird. She rides out with us, standing up, treated like the soldier she is. And then when we're back, you can do your quiet paperwork and make her disappear into whatever hole you people came out of. But not here, not now, not in front of the men she just bled to save." For a long moment, the gray-haired man said nothing. The rotors thundered. The medevac crew worked. And two men stood face to face on the top of Ember Ridge, one who had held the line and one who had come to erase it, and the whole thing balanced on a knife's edge. Then unexpectedly, the gray-haired man's face changed. Just slightly. Something that might on a warmer person have been the ghost of respect. "You know what she is," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what she did," Donovan said. "That's all I need to know." The man studied him for another second. Then he glanced past Donovan at Elena, and something passed between the two of them, some silent communication, in a language Donovan didn't speak, the language of people who lived in the erased places. And whatever Elena's face said back to him, it seemed to settle something. "She rides out with your platoon," the man said finally, "standing on the last bird. You have my word." He paused. "But understand, Sergeant, that once we're wheels down at the rear, she's ours, and this conversation never happened, and the version of today that goes in your file is the version we write. That part isn't negotiable. It never was. The only thing you just bought your men was 15 minutes in a memory. If that's worth it to you..." "It's worth it," Donovan said. "Then it's yours." The man stepped back. He gestured, and the other unmarked men peeled off toward the case rather than toward Elena. And just like that, the crisis dissolved. The wall of Alpha Platoon soldiers slowly unwound, and the whole terrible confrontation ended. Not in violence, but in a quiet, bitter compromise that Donovan understood he had both won and lost at the same time. He turned to Elena. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, and it took him a moment to place it, and when he did, it nearly undid him. She looked bewildered, not by the tactics, not by the danger, by the simple, incomprehensible fact that a man had just stood in front of the people who owned her and refused to let her be taken quietly for no reason, except that he thought she deserved better. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Her voice was very low, almost lost under the rotors. "You heard him. It changes nothing. The report's the same. I'm still theirs. All you did was pick a fight you couldn't win over 15 minutes. That don't matter." "They matter," Donovan said. "The 15 minutes matter. The standing up matters. You mattering matters, Elena. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing." He held her gaze. "Somebody taught you that you're a tool, that you get used and put back in the case and nobody's supposed to make a fuss. And maybe that's how your world works, and maybe I can't change your world. But for the next 15 minutes, you're in my world, and in my world, a soldier who saves 20 lives doesn't get carried off a ridge like luggage. She walks off it on her own 2 feet with her platoon around her, and if the people who own her don't like it, they can wait." He almost smiled. So they waited. Elena Brooks stared at him. And then for the first time all morning, Donovan watched the flat gray calm on her face give way. Not to grief, not to exhaustion, but to something entirely different. Something small and startled and almost young. Her eyes went bright. Her breath caught. and she looked away quickly out over the ridge, blinking hard, and Donovan had the grace to look away too, to give her the privacy of the moment because he understood that he had, just without meaning to, cracked open something in her that had been sealed shut for a very long time, and that the last thing she needed was an audience while it happened. They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, watching the medevac crew load the last of the wounded. Kowalski's Donovan said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly to give her something ordinary to hold on to. Leg's a mess, but they got the bleeding stopped an hour ago. He's tough. He'll keep it. He watched the litter being carried to the bird. He kept feeding rounds to the men around him the whole fight. Bled the whole time and never said a word. You'd have liked him if you'd ever, talked to anybody. I talked to Kowalski, Elena said quietly. He used to trade me his extra coffee packets for the good batteries. He called me Quiet Brooks. Said it like it was a kindness. Her jaw tightened. I didn't dislike anybody in this platoon, Sergeant. That was never the problem. I stayed quiet because getting close to people is how you end up doing exactly what I'm doing right now. Standing on a ridge watching them get loaded onto medevac birds and knowing you're the reason some of them didn't make it. Distance is protection. For them mostly. Not for me. She was silent for a beat. I broke my own rule today. The moment I opened that case in front of all of you, I stopped being able to disappear. And now I know Kowalski trades coffee for batteries. And I know Sanchez cried over Ochoa's body. And I know your name, really know it, not just as a signature on a form. And I'm going to carry all of that out of here. And it's going to hurt in a way that staying invisible never did. She looked at him. That's the other price nobody tells you about. Not the erasing, the remembering. You people are so much harder to forget than the missions. Donovan didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one. Sergeant. Whitfield approached and his face was doing something complicated. The QRF commander's on the ground, Major Hollis. He's asking for you, and he's asking, Whitfield glanced at Elena, then back at Donovan, clearly uncomfortable. He's asking about the sniper. Somebody must have called it in during the fight. He wants to know who broke the assault. He's asking for the shooter by name. Donovan felt Elena go very still beside him. Tell him the shooter's already been collected, the gray-haired man said, appearing at Donovan's shoulder with the quiet suddenness of his kind. Tell Major Hollis that the marksmanship in question is being handled through other channels, and that it's above his clearance and above yours, Corporal, and that the less any of you say about it, the better it'll go for everyone. That's not a threat. It's just how it works. He looked at Donovan. You understand I have to say that. I understand, Donovan said tightly, but something had shifted in him listening to it, watching this man smoothly reach out and begin erasing the truth in real time before the dead were even cold. And a thought took shape in Donovan's mind, small at first, and then growing a dangerous, stubborn sergeant's thought. Can I ask you something, he said to the gray-haired man. You can ask. This whole thing, Rhea's crossing the world to hunt her. Her being embedded in my platoon in the first place on a rotation that just happened to end up on a ridge. Rhea's just happened to attack with a company of trained soldiers. Donovan kept his voice mild. That's a hell of a coincidence. Her being here, him finding her here. You want to tell me how that happened? Because I've been chewing on it, and the more I chew, the less it tastes like a coincidence. For the first time, the gray-haired man's composure flickered. It was small. It was almost nothing. But Donovan had spent the whole morning watching Elena Brooks read the tiny tells of an enemy commander at 600 meters, and something of it had rubbed off. And he saw the flicker, saw the half-second of calculation behind the man's blank eyes, and he knew that he'd struck something. You should let that go, Sergeant, the man said quietly. Truly, for your own sake. Elena, Donovan didn't take his eyes off the man. You told me Reyes found out you were embedded here, that he arranged for your rotation to end up on this ridge so he could kill you clean. He watched the gray-haired man's face. But that doesn't work, does it? Reyes didn't control your rotation. Your own people controlled your rotation. Reyes couldn't have put you on this ridge. Only they could have put you on this ridge. He finally turned to look at Elena, and he watched the understanding hit her at the same instant it fully crystallized in him. They put you here, Elena, and then Reyes just happened to attack the exact ridge they put you on with exactly the force needed to overwhelm a platoon but exactly the kind of force a shadow line operator could break. The words tasted like poison. You weren't hiding here, you were bait. They didn't lose track of Reyes. They used you to find him. They put you on this ridge because they knew, or they hoped that he'd come for you, and they wanted him to come because him coming was the only way to draw him out into the open where he could finally be killed. The ridge seemed to go silent even under the rotors. Elena Brooks stared at Donovan, and then she slowly turned and stared at the gray-haired man, and her flat gray calm was gone entirely, now wiped away, replaced by something Donovan had not seen on her all morning, and hoped never to see again, a terrible dawning horror. "Tell me he's wrong," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me you didn't." The gray-haired man said nothing. "Tell me you didn't stake me out like a goat," Elena said, and now her voice was climbing, cracking 7 years of buried feeling, tearing loose all at once. "Tell me you didn't put me in a platoon of 29 people who had no idea, and use us all as bait to draw out Reyes. Tell me 9 men didn't just die because you decided the best way to catch him was to dangle me in front of him and see if he'd bite." She stopped. Her hands were shaking again, worse than before. And this time it wasn't the aftermath of battle. Ochoa, Bell, the others. They died so you could set a trap. They died and they never even knew they were part of it. They thought they were on a quiet defensive hold. They thought they were bored. Her voice broke completely. "You made me the bait, and you didn't tell me, because if you'd told me, I might have gotten them out. I might have found a way to save them. And you couldn't have, that could you? Because the trap only worked if it looked real, and it only looked real if the people in it didn't know they were in it." "Elena." The gray-haired man's voice was quiet, and for the first time something almost human moved in it. "Reyes killed 40 of our people over the last 4 years, hunting for you, hunting for the ghost who ended his principle. He was never going to stop. He was never going to come into the open on his own. The only way to end him was to give him something he wanted so badly he'd abandon his caution to take it. And the only thing he wanted that badly was you." He paused. "It worked. He's dead. It's over. 40 deaths ended because of what happened on this ridge today. I'm not going to insult you by pretending the 9 don't matter. They matter. I'll carry them too, but I made a choice that I'd make again, and so would you if you'd been the one holding all the pieces. You know that? You've made the same kind of choice. That's what we are." "That's what you made me be," Elena said, and there was something in her voice that Donovan had never heard, something that sounded almost like a woman waking up from a long sleep. "That's not what I am. That's what you turned me into. And I let you. For 7 years I let you, because you told me it was necessary, because you told me the math worked, because you're always so good at making the math work." She looked down at her own trembling hands. "But I did the math today too. 20 saved, 9 dead, 1 Reyes. And you know what? Standing here looking at Sanchez still holding Ochoa's hand, I don't think the math works. I don't think it's ever worked. I think I just got very, very good at not looking at the part of the equation that was people." The gray-haired man was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe you're right. That's a thing you're allowed to think now that it's over. That's a luxury the dead bought you." He gestured toward the waiting birds. "But the conversation's finished, Elena. It has to be. The last of the wounded are loaded. It's time." He looked at Donovan. "You got your 15 minutes, Sergeant. She walks out standing with your men. You have my word, and I keep it. But now it's time. Don't make it harder than it has to be." Donovan looked at Elena. She was staring at the ground, at her shaking hands, at the ridge that had turned out to be a trap, not just for Reyes, but for her, and for every man who died on it. And Donovan could see her retreating, could see the flat gray calm trying to reassemble itself over the raw thing that had been exposed, could see 7 years of training reaching to pull the mask back into place. And he understood that in a moment, she'd have it back on, and she'd walk to the bird, and she'd disappear into the erased world she came from, and she'd carry all of this alone, and the mask would seal shut over it, and maybe never open again. He couldn't stop it. He knew he couldn't stop it. The gray-haired man held all the cards and always had, but there was one thing he could do. "Elena!" Donovan stepped close to her, close enough to speak under the rotors just for the two of them. "Look at me, not the ground, Mado." He waited until her flat gray eyes lifted to his. "You said the remembering is the price, that you're going to carry Kowalski's coffee and Sanchez crying and my name out of here, and it's going to hurt worse than the erasing ever did. He held her gaze. So carry this too. Whatever they made you, whatever 7 years turned you into, you looked at that math today and you finally saw the people in it. You said it yourself. That's not the ghost they built. That's the woman underneath waking up. And she's still in there. After everything. She's still in there. He put his hand on her shoulder one last time. Don't let them put her back in the case, Elena. The rifle, sure, let them take the rifle. But not her. Whatever comes next, wherever they take you, you keep her. You just met her again after 7 years. Don't lose her a second time. Elena Brooks looked at him, and the mask did not reassemble. That was the thing Donovan would remember in all the years that came after and all the times he'd try and fail to tell this story to people who could never be allowed to hear it. He watched in that moment the flat gray calm try to close back over her face the way it had closed 1,000 times before, the way it had closed after every mission for 7 years, and he watched it fail. He watched Elena Brooks stand on the top of Ember Ridge and refuse, for the first time in longer than she could probably remember, to disappear behind the thing they'd made her. Her eyes stayed bright, her face stayed open, and when she spoke, her voice was not the flat, level voice of the shadow line operator, but something rawer, something realer, the voice of the woman underneath. I don't know if I can, she said. I don't know if there's enough of her left. There's enough, Donovan said. I met her today. She's the one who opened that case knowing it would cost her everything. She's the one who couldn't stop counting the 9. The ghost wouldn't count the 9, Elena. Only a person counts the 9. You're more her than you think. You've just been told for 7 years that you're not. He squeezed her shoulder and let go. Now go stand up. Walk to that bird on your own feet with your head up and let my men see the woman who saved them, not the ghost who's about to disappear. Give them that. Give yourself that. For a long moment, Elena Brooks didn't move, and then slowly she straightened. She lifted her chin, and she turned to face the platoon that had gathered once again without an order into a loose formation, flanking the path to the birds. 20 exhausted men who had stood up a second time to watch her go, and she looked at them, really looked at them, meeting each pair of eyes in turn the way she'd been afraid to for 4 months, and she did not put the mask back on. She walked toward the bird. An Alpha platoon one last time came to attention. Sanchez still stained with a dead boy's blood. Whitfield, who'd spotted for her and watched her do the impossible. Kowalski lifting his hand from his litter as she passed. Every man who could stand standing, every man who could saluting a wall of honor for a woman whose name they'd never really known, and whose story would be erased before the week was out, but who they would remember, every one of them, in the private, unerasable places where the true version of that morning would live for the rest of their lives. Elena Brooks walked between them, and at the door of the bird she stopped, and she turned back, and she looked at Sergeant Marcus Donovan one last time, and she brought her hand up in a salute that was not flat, not empty, not the salute of a tool acknowledging its handlers, but the salute of one soldier to another, full and human and alive. Donovan returned it. And then the gray-haired man's hand was at her elbow, gentle but certain, and Elena Brooks turned and stepped up into the unmarked bird, and the door slid shut, and the rotors climbed to a scream, and the ghost that Ember Ridge had briefly impossibly made human again lifted off the ridge she'd saved, and rose into the gray morning sky, carrying with her the coffee packets and the crying and the names, all the things that would hurt worse than the erasing, all the things that meant she was still, after everything, a person. Donovan watched the bird until it was a speck. Then he turned to his men, to the 20 living and the 9 dead, to the survivors of a battle the world would never know the truth of, and he found that he could not speak for a moment, and that was all right, because none of them could either. The speck disappeared into the gray, and then it was gone, and Sergeant Marcus Donovan was left standing on a ridge full of the living and the dead, with a truth in his chest that he was no longer allowed to tell anyone. That was the beginning of the part nobody warns you about. Not the battle, the after. They flew Alpha Platoon out an hour later, and by the time the birds touched down at the rear, the official version had already begun to set like concrete. Donovan could feel it happening around him, the smoothing, the flattening, the quiet subtraction of everything that mattered. A debriefing officer he'd never met took his statement in a small room with bad lighting, and Donovan told the truth, all of it. The locked case in the Barrett, in the woman who'd read an enemy commander's mind at 600 meters, in the fake route in the single shot that ended Reyes, and the officer wrote none of it down. He just listened and nodded, and when Donovan finished, he set down his pen that had never moved and said, "Sergeant, I want to make sure we've got the sequence right. The platoon repelled a numerically superior force through disciplined defensive fire and the sacrifice of 9 soldiers. Is that consistent with your recollection?" And Donovan understood that he was being told, not asked. "There was a sniper," Donovan said anyway. "A woman, Private Elena Brooks. She broke the whole assault. 9 of us died, but 20 of us lived, and every one of those 20 lived because of her. That's my recollection. That's the only recollection I've got." The officer looked at him for a long moment, not unkindly, almost with pity. "There's no Private Elena Brooks in your platoon's roster, Sergeant," he said quietly. "I've got the manifest right here. 29 went up. There's no Brooks on it. There never was." He turned the manifest around so Donovan could see it, and Donovan looked, and he ran his finger down the list of names, the living and the dead. Ochoa and Bell and Sanchez and Whitfield and Kowalski, all of them there, and where Elena Brooks should have been, there was nothing, a clean and seamless nothing. A gap that had been closed so perfectly you'd never know a person had been removed from it. "She was there," Donovan said. His voice had gone rough. "She was on that ridge. She saved my platoon." "I believe that you believe that," the officers said. "It was a bad morning, the worst kind. Men remember things after a fight like that. They fill in gaps. The mind does what it needs to do to make sense of surviving something it shouldn't have. That's not a mark against you. That's just what the mind does." He closed the folder. "But the record is the record, Sergeant. And the record says your platoon held Ember Ridge through its own courage. And that's the truth you're going to want to carry because it's a good truth, and it's a true one, whatever else you think you remember. Your men held. You held. Be proud of that. Let the rest go." Donovan walked out of that room and stood in the hallway for a long time shaking. And he understood that the erasing Elena had warned him about was not a metaphor. It was total. They hadn't just classified her. They'd removed her. Unstitched her from the fabric of the day so cleanly that in a year, in 5 years, even the men who'd saluted her would start to wonder if they'd dreamed her, would start to let the official version overwrite the real one. Because that's what official versions are built to do. But Donovan did not let it go. He gathered his men that night, the 20 of them in the barracks at the rear, and he shut the door and he said, "They're going to tell you she wasn't real. They're already telling me there's no Brooks on the manifest. They're going to say we imagined her, that we filled in a gap, that the mind does what it does after a bad fight. And in a year, some of you are going to start to believe it because it's easier to believe it. Because the paperwork all agrees and your own memory is just one voice against a whole system that says otherwise." He looked at each of them. "So I need you to do something for me. I need you to remember, not the official version, her, the case, the rifle, the route we faked, the shot that ended it. I need every one of you to hold on to the real morning hard for the rest of your lives, because we're the only proof she ever existed. They can erase the paper. They can't erase 20 men who watched her do it. As long as one of us remembers her true, she doesn't fully disappear. You understand me? As long as one of us remembers, they don't win." Sanchez was crying again. He didn't try to hide it. "I'll remember her, Sergeant," he said, "till the day I die. Quiet Brooks, she traded coffee for batteries, and she saved my life, and I never even said thank you." His voice cracked. "I'll remember her every day." And one by one, the men of Alpha Platoon made the same promise, and Donovan believed them, and it was the only funeral Elena Brooks would ever get 20 living men in a barracks room swearing to carry a woman the world had decided never existed. The years went by. They went by the way years do fast and slow at once. Donovan stayed in another 6 years, and then he got out, and he took a bay and got married and had a daughter, and the ordinary life closed over him the way ordinary life does, and most mornings Ember Ridge was a thing that had happened to someone else a long time ago. But not every morning. Some mornings he woke before dawn and lay in the dark next to his sleeping wife, and he was back on that ridge and he heard the Barrett speak. And he saw a small, quiet woman lift her hand in a salute that was full and human and alive, and he kept his promise. He remembered her true. He stayed in touch with the men. That was the other promise, the unspoken one. Once a year, most of them, they'd get on a call or find a way to a bar in some middle city, and they'd talk about everything except the thing, and then late when the drinks were down and the room was quiet, one of them would say her name, and they'd talk about her too. Sanchez became a school teacher of all things, and he told Donovan once that every year on the anniversary, he took the day off and drove somewhere quiet and just sat with her memory for an hour. Whitfield made it to Master Sergeant and stayed in and never stopped looking quietly through every channel he could reach for any trace of a shadow line operator named Brooks, and never found one and never expected to, and never stopped looking anyway. Kowalski kept his leg and walked with a limp the rest of his life, and told his kids a bedtime story about a quiet hero who saved a hilltop and never took the credit and never told them it was true. They remembered her true, all of them, for years. And then 11 years almost to the day after Ember Ridge, a package arrived at Sergeant Marcus Donovan's house with no return address. He almost didn't open it. In his old life, you learn to be careful about packages with no return address. But something about the handwriting on the label stopped him. Small and neat and precise, the handwriting of a person who'd once signed ammunition forms in a supply tent, and his hands were not quite steady as he cut the tape. Inside was a single object wrapped in cloth and a folded note. The object was a rifle round. A single Barrett casing spent the brass gone dark with age, and Donovan knew the moment he held it that it was one of the 3 she'd had left when the battle ended. One of the rounds she never had to fire because she was that good, because she ended a war with half a magazine, and he sat down heavily in his kitchen chair and held 11 years in the palm of his hand. He unfolded the note. The handwriting was hers. He'd have known it anywhere. Sergeant Donovan, it read, "I'm not supposed to send this. By the time you read it, I'll be somewhere they can't reach, and neither can you, and that's how it has to be. But I've spent 11 years thinking about something you said to me on that ridge, and I owed you an answer, and I've never been able to send one until now. You told me not to let them put her back in the case, the woman underneath. You told me I just met her again after 7 years and not to lose her a second time. I want you to know that I didn't. It cost me everything I had, and it took years, and there were mornings I wanted to just let the mask close because the remembering hurt exactly as much as I told you it would. Kowalski's coffee, Sanchez crying, your name, all of it. It never stopped hurting. But I never let it go because you were right that the hurting was the proof I was still a person, and a person was the only thing worth being after everything they made me. I got out, Sergeant. I don't know if you can understand what that means for someone like me, but people like me don't get out, and I did. And it's because a platoon of tired men stood up on a ridge and saluted me like I mattered, and one sergeant refused to let me be carried off like luggage. You gave me back a self I'd written off as dead. I've spent 11 years in learning to live inside it, so I'm sending you one of the 3. You said you'd carry the true version alone for the rest of your life. I wanted you to have proof that you weren't wrong to. She was real. I was real. And because of you, I still am. Tell your men thank you. Tell Sanchez, I remember the coffee. Tell Kowalski I'm glad he kept the leg. And tell yourself that the woman on that ridge got to grow old somewhere green and quiet because she did. And she's writing you this note with steady hands, and she remembers you true every day. Just like you remember her. Elena. Donovan sat in his kitchen for a very long time. He did not cry at first. He just held the note in the spent round and let 11 years move through him. The whole weight of a truth he'd carried alone finally answered, finally shared, finally, after all this time, confirmed by the one other person alive who knew the real shape of that morning. She'd made it. Against everything, against 7 years of Shadowline and 11 more of Erasure, against a system built to unmake people exactly like her. She'd found the woman underneath and she'd kept her, and she'd grown old, somewhere green and quiet, and she remembered him true. Then sitting alone at his kitchen table with the proof in his hands, Sergeant Marcus Donovan finally let himself cry, and it was not the crying of grief. It was the other kind, the kind that comes when something you'd given up as lost turns out to have been saved all along. He called them all that night, every man he could reach, Sanchez and Whitfield and Kowalski and the rest. He didn't tell them about the note, not the words of it, because some things are too much to say over a phone. But he told each of them the same thing, the only thing that mattered, the thing he'd waited 11 years to be able to say and know it for certain. She made it, Donovan said. Brooks, Elena, she got out. She's alive and she's free, and she's somewhere green and quiet, and she remembers us, and she wanted you to know she remembers. He heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of every call, heard grown men who'd carried her memory for a decade break down all over again. And he let them because as he'd broken down too. You kept your promise, he told them. All of you. You remembered her true for 11 years, when the whole world said she never existed. And it mattered. It's the reason she's alive. She told me so herself. The remembering, it's the reason she made it out. He gripped the phone. So we keep doing it. We remember her true for the rest of our lives, all of us, and we know that it was worth it. That she was worth it. That every one of us standing here breathing is because a quiet girl opened a case nobody knew about and decided we were worth saving. And they promised again, all of them, and this time the promise wasn't a funeral. This time it was something closer to a celebration. Donovan kept the spent round on the mantle in his house where anyone could see it, and nobody who saw it ever knew what it was, and that was all right because he knew and his men knew, and somewhere green and quiet Elena Brooks knew. When his daughter grew old enough to ask about it, he told her it was from a friend, a soldier, the bravest person he had ever known, a woman who'd saved his life and the lives of 19 other men on a bad morning a long time ago. And when his daughter asked what the woman's name was, Donovan smiled and he said her name out loud in his own house to his own child, where no manifest and no debriefing officer and no erasure could reach it. Elena Brooks, he said. Her name was Elena Brooks. And no matter what any piece of paper anywhere says, she was real, and she was the finest soldier who ever lived, and don't you ever let anybody tell you different. The world had tried to erase her. The record said she never existed. The manifest had a clean and seamless gap where a person used to be. But there were 20 men who remembered her true, and there was a spent round on a mantle, and there was a note in a locked drawer in Donovan's own hand, and there was a little girl who now knew her name, and every year the story spread a little further from a sergeant to his men to their children, quiet and unstoppable. The true version outliving the official one, the way truth always eventually does. They wanted her forgotten. They failed. Elena Brooks walked up Ember Ridge as a ghost that nobody could see, and she walked down it as a legend that no one could erase. And 11 years later, she was alive and free and remembered true by every soul she saved. And that in the end was the one thing the men in the unmarked helicopter never counted on, the one variable their perfect erasure could not account for, the simple and unkillable fact that you cannot delete a person from the hearts of the people she died to save. She saved 20 men on the worst morning of their lives. And in return, those 20 men saved her right back, not with rifles, but with memory. And they held that line for the rest of their lives, and they never once let it break.